When my husband Mark and I bought the house, it seemed perfect for starting a family. It was a quaint, older home with a wraparound porch full of charm. There was only one strange thing: the locked room. From our first tour, we noticed the room. On the second floor, near the back of the house, was a small windowless room with a heavy wooden door. It was securely locked. The real estate agent said it was probably a utility room and assured us it could be opened later. We didn't think much of it at the time. The house was old and locked doors weren't unusual. After we moved in, though, the locked room began to bother me. Mark and I tried several times to open it, but none of the keys fit. We even hired a locksmith, but he couldn't open it either. He mentioned the lock was antique and unfamiliar. He offered to break it open, but Mark didn't want to damage the old door, so we left it alone. That was our mistake. Weeks passed, and I couldn't shake the unease I felt around that room. The air in the hallway outside it seemed colder, and I always had the sensation that someone was on the other side, listening. Then, the noises started. At first, it was just creaking, like the house settling. I dismissed it as normal for an old house. But one night, I woke up to a sound that chilled me, a faint scratching, like something scraping against wood. I realized it was coming from the locked room. I shook Mark awake, but by the time he was up, the sound had stopped. He suggested it was probably a mouse in the walls and went back to sleep. But I knew what I had heard, and it wasn't a mouse. The following nights were quiet, and I told myself I was imagining things. But then, a week later, it escalated. I was home alone, reading in the living room, when I heard a loud thud from upstairs. My heart raced as I froze, listening. Another thud, followed by silence. I didn't want to go upstairs, but I couldn't ignore it. Grabbing a fireplace poker, I made my way up the stairs, every step heavy with dread. The air felt colder, and a musty smell clung to the hallway. I approached the locked room. Another thud. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. No answer. But then I heard it, a faint whisper coming from behind the door. Too soft to make out, but unmistakably human. Someone, or something, was speaking. I backed away, heart pounding, unable to move or run. Finally, the whispering stopped, and silence settled over the house. When Mark came home, I told him everything. He didn't laugh this time. Instead, he looked deeply worried. "We need to open that door," he said. The next day, Mark borrowed tools and set to work on the lock. I stood nearby, heart racing as he hammered away. After what felt like forever, the lock snapped and the door creaked open. Inside, the room was small and empty, except for one thing. In the center was an old, wooden crib. Dusty and cracked, the crib looked ancient. Inside it was a single yellowed piece of paper. Mark picked it up, unfolding it carefully. The writing, though faded, was legible, scrawled in a frantic hand. "Do not open. Do not let it out." We stared at the note in shock, fear rising in my chest. We didn't know what it meant, but an overwhelming sense of dread settled over us. Suddenly, from deep within the house, we heard it again, the scratching. But this time, it wasn't coming from the locked room. It was coming from downstairs. During a road trip, I was passing through Vermont when I started feeling sleepy behind the wheel. It was getting late, so I decided to stop in a small town called Middlebury. I looked for a hotel or motel and found a place called Middlebury Country Inn. It looked a little run down, but so did the whole town, to be honest. I wasn't looking for anything fancy, just a night's sleep. I parked in the lot and went to the small front office, which was located in the front corner of one of the two buildings that made up the motel. There was an older woman sitting behind the desk reading a book. The room was hot, and a table fan buzzed loudly, barely making a difference. I asked for a room, and she finally looked up from her book without greeting me and said $65. I assumed she meant $65 for the room, so I handed her my credit card. I asked if I could get a corner room, but she simply said, "No." Clearly, customer service was not included in the price. She handed me an old-fashioned key on a plain keyring. They still used actual keys at this place. I walked across the parking lot to my room. The door was difficult to unlock. I had to jiggle the key a bit before it finally turned. Before going in, I looked around the lot. There were only 2 other cars in the parking lot. It felt like a ghost town. I stepped into the room, and it smelled like a mix of stale cotton and something unpleasantly sour. I considered going back to ask for a different room, but I realized that all the rooms probably smelled the same, given the state of the place. The room was small, with a worn-out blue carpet, a couch, a small coffee table, and a bed. I shut the door and tried to lock it, but it was difficult, more so than unlocking it. After about 30 seconds of struggling, I felt like I might have broken it. But when I tried opening the door, it wouldn't budge. It wasn't fully locked, but as long as the door stayed closed, that was all that mattered to me at the moment. I crawled into the bed, the old spring squeaking under my weight. I tried to turn on the TV, but of course the remote didn't work. Frustrated, I just lay down and tried to fall asleep. That's when it happened. I nearly jumped out of my skin when there was a loud thump at the window. I looked and saw a woman standing outside peering in. She started talking, sounding hurt and in need of help. She said, "Please, let me in. I've hurt myself. I need help." She definitely saw me lying in the bed. I yelled back, telling her to go to the front desk, but she wouldn't stop pleading. There was no way I was opening that door. I had a bad feeling that this was some kind of trap. Eventually, after ignoring her for long enough, she left. I got up to check and make sure she was gone. When I looked out, she had indeed left. Feeling a bit shaken, I checked the lock on the door again to make sure it was secure. I gave the door a couple of good pulls and it didn't open. I then closed the curtains over the windows so she couldn't come back and see inside. That encounter rattled me. But after about half an hour, my nerves calmed and I started to drift off to sleep. I began having a strange dream where I was in an empty supermarket, running from a store manager who was chasing me. As the dream continued, I started hearing these clicking sounds. The noise grew louder until it seemed to take over the whole dream. Suddenly, I woke up. The room was cold, and I realized the blanket had been pulled off of me. As I sat up to pull the blanket back over, I saw a tall figure standing at the foot of the bed. Before I could scream, he raised a finger to his lips and whispered, "Shh, don't move." He told me he wouldn't hurt me if I stayed quiet and didn't make any sudden movements. Then he asked where my wallet was. I told him it was in my jeans pocket on the floor. I watched terrified as he moved from the foot of the bed to where my jeans lay. I heard him rummaging through the pocket until he found my wallet. He asked if I had anything else of value. I told him I was just on a road trip and didn't have much with me. Without another word, he left the room. As soon as he was gone, I rushed to try and lock the door, struggling as I had before. I then called the police, but they weren't able to provide immediate help. Later, we reviewed the security footage with the front desk attendant. The man had been wearing a face mask and a hat, hiding his features. I got my money back and decided to leave, thankful that I hadn't had much cash in my wallet. I canceled all my cards and ended up sleeping in my car that night. I learned a valuable lesson. Never stop at a sketchy motel, no matter how tired you are. I had been a park ranger at High Point National Park for almost 5 years. Most of my duties were routine, patrolling trails, assisting lost hikers, and keeping an eye on the rugged areas of the park. One such place was Raven's Ridge, a steep, heavily wooded hill with a stunning view of the river. Few people visited because of the challenging hike, and to be honest, I wasn't fond of it myself. Local legends surrounded Raven's Ridge. Tales of strange figures appearing at dusk and lights flickering on the hill, even though there were no homes or campsites nearby. Despite having heard these stories, I never paid them much attention. Still, the ridge had a way of making you feel watched, even on the clearest day. One late afternoon, I got a call from a hiker who had reached the ridge and felt uneasy. He didn't say much, just that he thought someone was watching him. It wasn't the first time I'd heard this, so I grabbed my gear and set out, figuring it was just nerves getting the better of him. The hike up felt as familiar as always, the trees thickening as I climbed higher. The sun was low, casting long shadows that stretched across the trail. I tried to shake off the sense of unease, blaming it on the stories that clung to this place. When I arrived at the ridge, the hiker was gone. I radioed in, but there was no response. It crossed my mind that maybe he had left after calling. I made a mental note to follow up when I got back, but for now I took a moment to enjoy the view. Layers of hills rolling into the distance, the river sparkling below. Then I noticed movement in the trees on the far side of the ridge. At first I thought it was just the light playing tricks, but then I saw it again. A figure stood just inside the tree line, far enough that I couldn't make out any details, but they were definitely watching me. "Hey," I called out, thinking it might be the hiker. No response. I stepped closer, but as I did, the figure retreated into the woods, vanishing into the shadows. A chill crept up my spine, and for a moment, I considered heading back down the trail. But something stopped me. Curiosity, maybe, or a need to prove that it was nothing. I moved toward the spot where I had seen the figure, pushing through the brush. As I got closer, I began to hear something. A low, indistinct murmur. It was soft at first, but it grew louder the closer I got, like voices whispering just beyond the trees. The sound was unnerving, but I pressed on, eventually stepping into a small clearing. It was about 10 feet across, with thick trees all around. In the center was a circle of smooth stones, arranged in a perfect ring. They looked ancient, worn by time, and untouched by any human activity. Outside the circle, hidden in the tall grass, I found something else. A small wooden carving. It was a crude figure, only about 6 inches tall, shaped like a human, but with elongated arms and no face. Carved deeply into its chest was a spiral, a symbol I didn't recognize. I felt a sudden wave of dread as I stood there. The air seemed to thicken, the whispering gone now, replaced by a heavy silence. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though no one was in sight. It wasn't just the clearing or the figure that unnerved me. It was the sense that I had intruded on something I wasn't meant to see. I left the clearing quickly, trying not to appear panicked as I made my way back down the trail. The feeling of being watched never left, though, and every time I glanced over my shoulder, the forest was still. When I returned to the station, I reported what I had seen, leaving out the part about the voices and the carving. My supervisor didn't seem overly concerned. "Raven's Ridge gets in your head," he said with a shrug. "You're not the first to see something weird up there." But I knew what I'd seen, and more importantly, I knew what I had felt. I haven't been back to Raven's Ridge since. Whoever or whatever was watching me that day, I have no desire to encounter it again. Yet part of me can't help but wonder just how long it had been there, hidden in the trees, waiting for someone to notice. When my wife Anna and I moved into our new house on Brierwood Lane, it felt like a dream come true. The house was beautiful. 3 bedrooms, a spacious yard, and a kitchen Anna adored. It was everything we had been searching for, and after months of house hunting, we were thrilled to finally settle in. The house had been empty for a while, according to the real estate agent. The previous owners had left quickly, but she assured us there was no cause for concern. We didn't think much of it, too excited to care about the house's past. For the first few days, everything was perfect. We unpacked, rearranged furniture, and explored the quiet neighborhood. But soon, small, unexplained things started happening. It began with the lights. On our second night, the hallway light flickered. Thinking it was a bad bulb, I replaced it, but the flickering continued. I assumed it was an electrical issue and made a mental note to check the wiring. Then came the footsteps. One night, as we lay in bed half asleep, we both heard it. Faint footsteps, like someone walking downstairs. The sound was soft but distinct. I grabbed a baseball bat and cautiously went to check. The house was empty. Anna suggested it might be the old wood floors creaking, but the footsteps had sounded deliberate, like someone pacing. Over the next few weeks, the footsteps became more frequent, always at night, always from different parts of the house. One night it sounded like someone was right outside our bedroom door. I threw open the door. Nothing. Just an empty, dark hallway. Anna began seeing shadows in her peripheral vision, dark shapes darting past doorways or lingering in corners. At first she dismissed them, but after it happened enough times, she grew nervous. One evening, a loud crash echoed from upstairs. We rushed to the master bedroom, expecting to find something broken, but everything was where it should be. Nothing had fallen. "What's going on?" Anna whispered, fear creeping into her voice. I didn't have an answer. I checked every room, but everything seemed normal. Yet we both knew we had heard the crash. Then, one night, things escalated. The room suddenly grew freezing, as if someone had opened a window in the dead of winter. The temperature dropped so quickly that Anna and I shivered under the blankets. Then we heard it. A voice. At first it was faint, like a whisper carried on the wind. But it grew louder, a raspy, low voice coming from the darkest corner of the room. Anna gripped my arm, her face pale. "Do you hear that?" I nodded. The voice grew clearer, repeating the same phrase over and over, though we couldn't make out the words. I reached for my phone to call someone, but just as suddenly as it had started, the voice stopped. The room fell silent, though the air still felt oppressive. The next day I called a contractor to inspect the house. I mentioned the strange noises, the flickering lights, and the cold spots. He checked everything, the wiring, foundation, and insulation, but found nothing wrong. "Old houses can be noisy," he said with a shrug. "Nothing to worry about." But we were worried. Anna suggested we research the house's history. After digging through town records, we discovered something unsettling. The previous owner, George Hadley, had lived there for 20 years. He had been reclusive and died alone in the house. His body hadn't been found for days. After learning about George, the activity intensified. The footsteps grew louder, the shadows seemed darker, and the voice returned, clearer this time. "Get out." We didn't wait for more. The next morning, we packed our bags and left. We never spent another night in that house. We sold it months later at a loss. I don't know what became of the new owners, and I never asked. But I hope, for their sake, that whatever haunted that house is finally at rest, because it sure wasn't when we lived there. Back when I was in my early 20s, I worked the night shift at a quiet gas station off a lonely highway in Nevada. The job was mostly uneventful, stocking shelves, ringing up the occasional traveler, and trying to stay awake through the long, solitary hours. The isolation was both a blessing and a curse. It gave me time to think, but it also made every little noise seem amplified in the stillness of the night. One particular night, around 2 a.m., a thick fog rolled in, shrouding the station and the surrounding desert in a dense white mist. The visibility dropped to almost nothing, and the eerie silence of the fog made the whole place feel cut off from the rest of the world. I had the radio on, quietly playing some old rock tunes, trying to keep myself company. A little after 3 a.m., a man walked in. He was tall and thin, with a worn-out look and clothes that seemed a bit too clean for someone wandering in the fog. He gave me a nod, then started browsing the aisles. There was something off about him, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. His presence made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Can I help you with anything?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He didn't answer, just continued to wander the aisles, picking up items and putting them back. After a few minutes, he came up to the counter with a pack of gum and a soda. As I rang him up, I noticed his hands were trembling slightly. "Rough night?" I asked, trying to make small talk. He looked at me with hollow eyes and said, "You could say that. Do you believe in ghosts?" The question caught me off guard. "I guess so. Why do you ask?" He didn't answer right away, just stared at the fog outside the window. "I saw something out there tonight, something I can't explain." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What did you see?" "A woman," he said quietly. "She was standing in the middle of the road, just staring at me. I stopped my car, but when I got out, she was gone. Then I saw her again in my rearview mirror, sitting in the back seat." My heart started to race. Did you bring her here?" He shook his head. "I don't know. I just kept driving. I thought I lost her, but the feeling, it's like she's still with me. I glanced around the empty station, the shadows seeming darker and more menacing. Maybe you should stay here for a bit, wait until the fog clears. He nodded slowly. Yeah, maybe I will. He took a seat at one of the small tables by the window, and I went back to my duties, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling his story had given me. The minutes dragged on and the fog outside seemed to grow thicker. I kept glancing at the man, who was staring out the window, his expression blank and distant. Around 4 a.m., the doorbell chimed, signaling another customer. A young woman walked in, her clothes wet from the fog, her hair hanging limp around her face. She looked lost and confused, her eyes darting around the station. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. She didn't respond, just walked up to the counter and stared at me. Her eyes were dark and empty, like deep pools of nothingness. I felt a cold dread wash over me, and my breath caught in my throat. The man at the table stood up, abruptly, knocking over his chair. "It's her," he whispered, backing away slowly. "It's the woman I saw." The woman turned her head slowly to look at him, and a faint, eerie smile spread across her lips. The temperature in the room seemed to drop and the lights flickered. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. "What do you want?" I managed to ask. She didn't answer, just continued to smile that chilling smile. The man backed up against the wall, his face pale with fear. Suddenly the woman vanished. One moment she was there and the next she was gone, leaving behind an oppressive silence. The man slid down the wall, burying his face in his hands. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to call the police, but what would I say? That a ghost had walked into my gas station? Instead, I grabbed the man by the arm and led him to the back room, locking the door behind us. We stayed there until dawn, neither of us saying a word. When the sun finally rose and the fog began to lift, we ventured out. The gas station was empty, and there was no sign of the woman. The man thanked me and left, his car disappearing down the highway. I never saw him again, but the memory of that night stayed with me. The gas station felt different after that. I quit the job a few weeks later. Last year, my friend Mark and I were planning a trip. We wanted something different, an adventure that would take us off the beaten path. Mark, always the tech-savvy one, suggested we look for unique accommodations on the dark web. It sounded crazy, but we were both intrigued by the idea. After all, the dark web was known for its secrecy and mystery, and we figured it might offer something truly unique. After some searching, Mark found a listing for an Airbnb-like rental in a remote mountain town. The photos showed a rustic, charming cabin surrounded by dense forest, far from civilization. The listing boasted about its seclusion, perfect for those wanting to disconnect from the world. The price was incredibly low, which should have been our first red flag, but our curiosity got the better of us. We booked the cabin and received a confirmation email with detailed directions and a key code for the lockbox. The directions were oddly specific, leading us through a series of winding, unmarked roads. The anticipation and thrill of the unknown made the journey seem like an adventure in itself. When we finally arrived, the cabin looked exactly like the photos, quaint and secluded with an almost eerie tranquility. We let ourselves in, marveling at the rustic interior, which was even more charming in person. There was no cell service and the nearest town was miles away, but we didn't mind. We were here to disconnect and enjoy the solitude. The first night went smoothly. We cooked dinner, played cards, and enjoyed the peace and quiet. It was only the next day that things started to feel off. Mark went out for a hike in the morning while I stayed behind to read. Around noon he still hadn't returned, and I began to worry. I decided to head out and look for him, following the trail he mentioned earlier. As I walked through the dense forest, a sense of unease settled over me. The woods were silent, unnaturally so, with not even the chirping of birds to break the quiet. After about an hour of searching, I found Mark sitting on a fallen log, staring at something in his hands. As I got closer, I saw that it was a small weathered journal. He looked up at me, his face pale. "Look what I found," he said, handing me the journal. The pages were filled with entries dating back several years. Most of them were mundane, detailing hikes and wildlife sightings, but the entries became increasingly disturbing. The last few pages described strange occurrences, figures seen in the woods at night, eerie whispers, and a sense of being watched. We hurried back to the cabin, the sense of unease growing. That night, as we sat by the fireplace, we heard it, a faint whispering coming from outside. It was barely audible, like the wind carrying voices through the trees. We looked at each other, fear in our eyes. Mark grabbed a flashlight and we stepped outside. The whispering grew louder, seemingly coming from all directions. We scanned the tree line but saw nothing. Just as we were about to head back inside, the flashlight flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. We rushed back into the cabin, locking the door behind us. The whispering continued, now accompanied by soft tapping on the windows. We huddled together, trying to convince ourselves it was just the wind or animals. Around midnight, the noises stopped. The silence was deafening, but at least it allowed us to fall into an uneasy sleep. We decided to leave first thing in the morning, cutting our trip short. At dawn, we packed our things and headed for the car. As we approached, we saw something that made our blood run cold. Carved into the trunk of a tree next to the cabin were the words, "Leave and never return." We didn't need any more encouragement. We got into the car and drove as fast as we could down the winding roads, not stopping until we reached the nearest town. Once we had cell service, we canceled our Airbnb immediately. We sent multiple emails and calls to the hosts, but never received a response. Just our deposit back and a "thank you for your stay" auto-response. When we got back home, we tried to put the experience behind us. But Mark did some digging and discovered that several people had gone missing in that area over the years, their cases never solved. The memory of that trip still haunts me. Booking that cabin was a mistake, one that nearly cost us more than just our peace of mind. When I was 24, I had to move out of state for a new job. I was excited but also a little nervous as I didn't know anyone in the area. I needed to find a place to live quickly, and I wanted something affordable that wouldn't break the bank. I posted on several roommate-finding websites and apps, including Facebook and Craigslist, hoping to find someone who had a room available. A guy named Tom reached out to me on Facebook saying he had a room for rent in his house. I checked out his profile and photos. He looked like a normal guy and nothing seemed off. I was open to having a male roommate, despite my parents' concerns about the situation. Tom and I set up a video call, during which he gave me a virtual tour of the house. It was a modest 2-bedroom place in a quiet neighborhood, just a 15-minute drive from my new job. Tom seemed nice enough during our conversation, friendly but not overly familiar. His rent price was reasonable and his house rules were simple: no smoking, no loud music after 10 p.m., and clean up after yourself. He said the room was available right away, which was perfect for me since I needed to move in quickly. We agreed on the terms, and a week later I packed up my things and drove down to my new home. When I arrived, Tom greeted me out front and handed me the key to the house. He was shorter than I expected, and his voice was softer in person, but he seemed friendly enough. He helped me carry my heavier bags inside and showed me to my room. The room was already furnished, which was convenient, and Tom mentioned that his previous roommate had moved out a few weeks earlier. I spent the rest of the day settling in, replacing the pillows and bed sheets with my own and unpacking my clothes. The next day was a Sunday, and Tom offered to show me around town. I wasn't particularly eager to spend the day with him, but I agreed, thinking it would be a good way to get off on the right foot with my new roommate. He drove me around, pointing out the shopping centers, restaurants, and parks in the area. Then he suggested we grab lunch at a local diner. I wasn't really hungry, but I didn't want to be rude, so I agreed. During lunch, I noticed that Tom was a bit pushy. He kept asking personal questions, and when I didn't respond with the enthusiasm he seemed to expect, he would go quiet and sulk. It was a little uncomfortable, but I figured he was just trying to be friendly. That week, I started my new job, and my focus shifted to adjusting to my work routine. It wasn't until a few days later, when I did my laundry, that I noticed something strange. My clothes in the hamper seemed to have been moved around, like someone had gone through them. Then, I realized something was missing. One of my bras. I searched my room top to bottom but couldn't find it anywhere. A disturbing thought crossed my mind. What if Tom had taken it? But I refused to believe it. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, and there was no way I could confront him without proof. Still, I felt uneasy, and I wished there was a lock on my bedroom door. That weekend, while Tom was out, I went to the hardware store and bought a lockable doorknob. I installed it myself, feeling a bit more secure knowing I could lock my door when I wasn't home. I planned to tell Tom about it the next time I saw him, but that night he didn't come home. His work schedule seemed unpredictable, and he often stayed out late. Then around 1:30 a.m., I was woken up by loud banging on my bedroom door. It was Tom, and he was yelling my name. He sounded angry. I pretended to be asleep, too scared to open the door. I had a feeling it had to do with the new doorknob. The next morning, I woke up to several texts from Tom saying we needed to talk. I replied asking if it was about the doorknob, and he responded with a curt, "Yes." I apologized and explained that I installed it for privacy, as I was uncomfortable without a lock. His tone softened a bit, but he still insisted that I remove the lock and put the old doorknob back on. I was confused and upset, but I didn't want to escalate the situation. I changed the doorknob back later that day, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Tom had tried to come into my room that night. The thought scared me. How had he even known about the new doorknob unless he had tried to enter my room while I was sleeping? A few days later, there was a knock on the door. It was a woman around my age, and she looked worried. She asked if I was living with Tom, and when I said yes, she urged me to leave immediately. She explained that Tom had multiple restraining orders against him from different women, and he had a history of stalking and harassment. I was shocked. She told me she had seen me moving in and wanted to warn me, but had waited until Tom wasn't home. I thanked her, feeling a rush of fear. I knew I had to get out of there. I started packing my things and contacted a woman who had posted an ad for a sublet across town. She told me I could move in right away, which was a huge relief. I texted Tom, telling him I needed to move out due to a family emergency. He didn't reply for a while, but when he got home, he asked me about my text. I repeated my story, and he said he'd give me my rent money back the next day after going to the bank. I was relieved, but about an hour later, he knocked on my door and asked, "Did someone say something to you?" My heart raced, but I played dumb, saying no. He stared at me for a moment, then said, "It just seems like you're running away for another reason." I insisted it was just the family emergency, and he reluctantly accepted my explanation. For that night, things took a terrifying turn. I woke up in the middle of the night to find Tom sitting on the end of my bed. I screamed, but he put his hand over my mouth and shushed me. He insisted he wasn't going to hurt me, and that I shouldn't believe what others had said about him. I was terrified and begged him to leave, but he just kept talking, trying to convince me that he wasn't a threat. I managed to get out of bed and ran for the door. Tom yelled at me to stop, but I bolted outside with my phone and called the police. I hid in the bushes until they arrived. When the police showed up, I explained everything. They made Tom come outside and questioned him. He tried to act normal, but one of the officers later told me that Tom had been arrested before for similar incidents. I packed up the rest of my things while the police were there and left the house. Tom did give me back my rent money, but I didn't care about that. I was just glad to be out of there. Late one night, I got curious and decided to explore the dark web. I had heard it was a dangerous place, but I wanted to see for myself. As I clicked through the hidden sites, I came across one that advertised live feeds of people in distress. It sounded creepy, but my curiosity got the better of me, and I clicked on the link. The site took me to a page with a live video of a person tied up in a dimly lit room. They looked terrified, and my heart sank. I tried to leave the site, but my computer froze and I couldn't get away from the horrifying video. As I watched, the video switched to a new person, a young one who was crying and begging for help. The chat on the site was filled with people encouraging the tormentors and asking for more violence. I felt sick to my stomach, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I liked horror movies, but would never ever wish them to be real. I desperately tried to close my laptop, but it wouldn't budge. I was stuck watching these awful things, feeling helpless and scared. The video changed again and again, each one more disturbing than the last. I felt trapped, like I was being forced to be a part of something evil. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, my computer shut down on its own. I was left in the dark, trembling and haunted by the images I had seen. I couldn't believe that something so horrifying existed on the internet. For weeks, I couldn't shake the fear and unease that had taken hold of me. Every little noise made me jump, and I constantly felt like someone was watching me. The dark web had invaded my mind, leaving me paranoid and on edge. Then I started receiving messages from an unknown sender. They knew personal details about me, like my address, phone number, and even my social media accounts. The messages were threatening and made it clear that they knew what I had seen on the dark web. I was terrified, not knowing who these people were or what they were capable of. I felt like I was being watched at all times, like I was never safe. The fear was consuming me, and I didn't know what to do. Finally, I decided to seek help from a cybersecurity expert. They were able to trace the messages back to the people behind them and put a stop to the threats. But even after that, I couldn't escape the nightmares and the lingering feeling of dread. The lingering feeling of dread never quite left me, but I slowly moved on with my life. Years later, I found myself starting a new job at a large, bustling company. I felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness as I settled into my new desk. One morning, as I walked in, I noticed a small folded note left discreetly on my desk. My heart skipped a beat as I unfolded it and read the message inside. It simply said, "I know what you did on the dark web," followed by the username I had used that fateful night. Fear gripped me once more, and I looked around the office, trying to see if anyone was watching me. Who could have known about my past? Was it someone from that dark website? Or had my secret somehow leaked out to someone else? The feeling of being watched returned, and I couldn't shake the unease that had haunted me for so long. Whoever had left that note knew something about me, something I had thought was buried in the past. As the day went on, I couldn't concentrate on my work. The mystery of the note gnawed at me, and I felt like I was being pulled back into the darkness I had tried so hard to escape. The dark web had resurfaced in my life, threatening to destroy everything I had built since that fateful night. I was trapped once again, and I didn't know if I would ever find a way out. I own a quaint 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom cabin in the Woods of Vermont, which I list on Airbnb when I'm not using it. The cabin has a master bedroom where I store my personal items, secured with a sturdy lock and a deadbolt. It's not a treasure trove, mostly just personal mementos and clothing. In the early fall, I plan to journey from my primary residence in Florida to spend some time in the serene Vermont woods. I typically employ a housekeeper to spruce up the place after guests depart, but since I was heading there right after the current guest's departure, I opted to handle the cleaning myself. The most recent guest was a gentleman named Carlos, who had booked the cabin for himself and his girlfriend. He seemed reliable, and I generally prefer renting to couples or small groups of women, as they're less likely to host raucous parties that could damage the property. I embarked on my journey at dawn. The drive was a grueling 18 hours, and by the time I reached the cabin, it was close to midnight. I was too weary to inspect the cabin for any mess, so I headed straight to my bedroom, fell onto the bed, and drifted off to sleep. I was jolted awake around 1 a.m., unsure of what had disturbed my sleep. I glanced at my phone for any notifications, then switched on the bedside lamp and scanned the room. Nothing seemed amiss, so I ventured into the living room. Everything appeared in order there as well, so I proceeded to check the guest bedrooms. They were vacant, although one of the beds seemed to have been used. I have a security camera installed at the cabin's entrance, and I decided to review its footage. The camera had captured a man entering the cabin alone 3 days prior. There were no other motion alerts until my arrival. This struck me as odd, so I reached out to Carlos via the Airbnb app to inquire if he had checked out without any issues. I inspected the bedroom where I presumed Carlos had slept, but found nothing unusual. Then I heard the faint sound of the master bedroom door closing. I moved to the living room and stared at the master bedroom door. I called out Carlos's name but received no response. I noticed that the light was still on in the room, visible through the gap under the door. I crouched down to peek under the door, and to my horror, I saw 2 feet standing a few feet away from the door. I rushed to the kitchen to grab the largest chef's knife, only to find it missing. I decided to exit the cabin and dial 911. The police arrived and discovered Carlos in the living room. He insisted that he merely needed a place to stay for one more night and denied taking the knife, which had mysteriously reappeared in the knife block. The police let him go with a warning and advised me to report the incident to Airbnb. Once the police and Carlos had left, I immediately changed the lock code and contacted Airbnb. Although they didn't compensate me for the extra day Carlos had stayed, they did ban him from using the app. Despite this, I couldn't shake off the unsettling feeling, pondering over what Carlos might have been planning to do in my own cabin. When I was in college, I took a night shift job at a small 24-hour diner on the outskirts of town. It wasn't the most glamorous gig, but it paid well, and I liked the quiet hours when most of the world was asleep. The diner, Joe's Place, had been around for decades, and the regulars were mostly truckers and night owls who enjoyed the solitude and strong coffee. My shifts typically started at 11 p.m. and ended at 7 a.m. There were usually just 2 of us working, me and the cook, Tim, who had been at Joe's for over 10 years. Tim was a quiet guy, kept to himself, and didn't talk much about his past. I didn't mind. The quiet suited me. One night, about a month into my job, a heavy rainstorm hit. The diner was nearly empty, just a few regulars sitting at the counter. Around 2 a.m. a man walked in, soaked to the bone. He looked to be in his late 40s with tired eyes and a worn-out expression. He sat down at the far end of the counter, away from everyone else. "Coffee, please," he muttered, not making eye contact. I poured him a cup and left him alone, sensing he didn't want to talk. As the hours passed, the regulars left one by one until it was just me, Tim, and the stranger. The rain pounded against the windows and the wind howled outside, making the diner feel like a small, isolated island. Around 3:30 a.m. the man waved me over. I walked up expecting him to ask for a refill or something, but instead he looked up at me with haunted eyes. "You ever hear about the old asylum up on Willow Hill?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. I nodded. The Willow Hill Asylum had been closed down for years, but it was a local legend. People said it was haunted, that the spirits of the patients still roamed the halls. Kids would dare each other to go there on Halloween, but few actually did. "I used to work there," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Night shifts, just like you. It was a long time ago before they shut it down." A chill ran down my spine. I glanced at Tim, who was leaning against the kitchen doorway, listening intently. "What happened?" I asked, drawn in despite myself. The man took a deep breath, staring into his coffee. "It started with the patients," he said. "They'd wake up in the middle of the night, screaming about a shadow in their rooms. The doctors said it was just night terrors, but the patients insisted it was real. They said the shadow would stand at the foot of their beds, whispering their names." He paused, taking a shaky sip of his coffee. "One night I was doing my rounds, checking on the patients. I heard a noise coming from one of the rooms, a sort of low, whispering sound. I thought maybe one of the patients was having another nightmare, so I went to check." His eyes met mine, and I saw genuine fear in them. When I opened the door, the room was pitch black, except for a small patch of light from the hallway. In that light, I saw a figure, a tall, dark shadow, standing at the foot of the bed. It turned to look at me, and I felt this cold, horrible dread wash over me. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, The shadow started moving towards me, and then everything went black. He stopped, his hands trembling slightly. When I woke up, I was in a different room lying on the floor. The doctor said I must have fainted, but I knew what I saw. After that night, more and more people started seeing the shadow. Patients, nurses, even the doctors. It got so bad that they finally shut the place down. I shivered, feeling the temperature in the diner drop. Tim walked over, his usual stoic expression replaced by a look of concern. "Why are you telling us this?" Tim asked, his voice steady. The man looked at us, his eyes hollow. "Because I've seen it again," he said. "A few nights ago, in my own home. It was standing at the foot of my bed, just like before. I think it's followed me." We sat in stunned silence, the only sound the rain pounding against the windows. The man got up, leaving a crumpled bill on the counter, and walked out into the storm. Tim and I exchanged glances, unsure of what to say. That night, after my shift ended, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The shadows in my apartment seemed darker, more menacing. As I lay in bed, I found myself staring at the foot of it, half expecting to see a figure standing there. I travel frequently for work, and hotel rooms have become a second home to me. I've stayed in everything from luxurious suites to budget motels, always looking for that comfortable middle ground. On a recent business trip, I booked a room at the Grand Vista Hotel in San Francisco, California. It was a reputable establishment, known for its modern amenities and excellent service. I checked in late in the evening, tired from a long day of meetings and eager to get some rest. The room was just as expected, clean, stylish, and well-appointed. A large king-sized bed dominated the space, with a sleek desk and a comfortable lounge chair by the window, offering a view of the city. I quickly unpacked, set up my laptop on the desk, and began catching up on some last-minute emails. It was the usual routine, something I could do almost automatically at this point. After finishing my work, I decided to relax with a hot shower. As I stepped out of the bathroom, I noticed something odd. There was a small black object on the bookshelf facing the bed. It looked like a charger or some kind of electronic device. Curious, I picked it up. It was a USB charger with a tiny pinhole lens on the side. My stomach dropped. It looked like a hidden camera. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. Why would there be a camera in my room? I quickly scanned the rest of the room, looking for any other devices. Near the TV, I found another, this time hidden in what appeared to be an air freshener. Panic set in, as I realized that someone had been watching me, perhaps even recording my every move. I considered my options. Should I call the hotel management? The police? But what if they were in on it? My mind raced with possibilities, each more sinister than the last. Trying to stay calm, I decided to document everything. I took out my phone and photographed the hidden cameras, making sure to get clear shots of the devices and their placements. I felt a sense of urgency growing. Whoever had placed these cameras might be watching me right now. I unplugged the devices and placed them on the bed, feeling slightly better but still on edge. I needed to figure out who was behind this and get out of there. I grabbed my laptop and started searching online for any incidents or reviews mentioning hidden cameras at the Grand Vista Hotel. I found nothing, which only made me more uneasy. Suddenly there was a knock at the door. My heart leapt into my throat. I hesitated, then approached the door cautiously. "Who is it?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's hotel security, sir. We received a report of some unusual activity in your room." My blood ran cold. Unusual activity? Did they know I had found the cameras? I took a deep breath and opened the door. A man in a hotel uniform stood there, looking professional and calm. He gave me a reassuring smile. "Is everything all right, sir? We just wanted to check in and make sure." I considered lying, saying everything was fine, but decided against it. "Actually, no," I said. stepping back to let him in. "I found these hidden cameras in my room." I gestured to the devices on the bed. The security officer's expression shifted from polite concern to serious attention. He walked over to the bed and examined the cameras. "This is very concerning," he said, looking back at me. "Let me take these downstairs and call the police. We'll get to the bottom of this." He collected the devices and left the room, leaving me standing there, feeling exposed and vulnerable. I locked the door behind him and sat on the edge of the bed, waiting. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even with the cameras gone. Finally, the phone rang. It was the hotel manager, apologizing profusely for the situation. He assured me that they were taking this very seriously and that the police were on their way. He offered to move me to another room, but I declined. I didn't want to stay in the hotel any longer than necessary. The police arrived shortly after and took my statement. They were professional and thorough, assuring me that they would investigate the matter. I handed over the photos I had taken and gave them a detailed description of the cameras and where I had found them. The officers asked if I had noticed anything else unusual or if anyone had been acting suspiciously. I told them about the knock on the door from hotel security and how the officer had taken the devices. The officers exchanged a glance. "Sir," one of them said, "we don't have hotel security officers collecting evidence. That man wasn't with us." A chill ran down my spine. Who had I let into my room? And where were the cameras now? The police searched the hotel for the man I had described, but found no one matching his description. The hotel's security footage revealed nothing. No sign of the man entering or leaving the building. The investigation quickly hit a dead end. The cameras had been professionally hidden and there were no clear leads on who had placed them or why. The hotel management cooperated fully with the police, but they seemed just as baffled as I was. I checked out that night, not willing to stay another minute in that room. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I checked into a new hotel, I meticulously searched the room for hidden cameras, my paranoia growing. The police never found the man who had posed as hotel security, and the case eventually went cold. The experience left me deeply unsettled, a stark reminder of the vulnerabilities we face even in seemingly safe environments. To this day, I double-check every room I stay in, always wary, always on guard. The Grand Vista Hotel experience taught me a lesson I'll never forget. You never really know who might be watching. A few years back, I worked the graveyard shift as a security guard at a large abandoned factory on the outskirts of Detroit. The factory had been shut down for over a decade, but the company that owned it still wanted a presence on site to deter vandals and trespassers. The place was massive, with sprawling buildings and long, empty corridors that seemed to stretch on forever. I worked alone most nights, patrolling the grounds and making sure everything was secure. It was a lonely job, but it paid well and I didn't mind the solitude. The factory was creepy though, rusted machinery, broken windows, and a constant feeling of being watched. But the scariest part was the basement. The basement was a labyrinth of narrow hallways and storage rooms, and the air down there was always damp and cold. There were rumors among the guards about strange occurrences, whispers in the dark, footsteps that didn't belong to anyone, and shadows moving on their own. I didn't believe in ghosts, but the basement still gave me the creeps. One particularly cold winter night, I was making my rounds. The wind howled outside, rattling the loose panels and making the old building groan. Around 2 a.m., I decided to check the basement. It wasn't part of my usual routine, but I had a strange feeling, like something was pulling me down there. I grabbed my flashlight and headed down the stairs, the beam of light cutting through the thick darkness. The air grew colder with each step, and my breath came out in white puffs. I started my patrol, shining the flashlight into each room, checking for anything unusual. About halfway through, I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It sounded like metal on metal echoing through the empty halls. I followed the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. The tapping grew louder as I approached an old storage room at the far end of the basement. I pushed the door open and the tapping stopped. The room was empty, just a few rusted shelves and some old equipment. I stepped inside, sweeping the flashlight across the room. That's when I saw it. A figure standing in the corner, shrouded in darkness. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice echoing off the walls. The figure didn't move. I took a step closer, and my flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The figure seemed to dissolve into the darkness, and the room fell silent. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me, plunging the room into pitch blackness. I spun around, banging on the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck, followed by a whisper that sent chills down my spine. "Get out." I turned, swinging the flashlight wildly, but there was no one there. The temperature in the room dropped even further, and I could feel the presence closing in on me. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony of voices, each one filled with anger and despair. "Get out. Get out." I pounded on the door, shouting for help, but my voice was swallowed by the darkness. The flashlight flickered again, and I saw the figure reappear, closer this time, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. With a final burst of strength, I threw myself against the door and it flew open. I stumbled into the hallway, slamming the door behind me. The whisper stopped abruptly and the air felt lighter, warmer. I didn't stop running until I reached the main floor, my heart racing and my breath coming in ragged gasps. I leaned against the wall, trying to calm myself, but the memory of those whispers and the figure's glowing eyes stayed with me. I reported the incident to my supervisor, but he just shrugged it off, saying it was probably my imagination or the wind playing tricks on me. I didn't argue, but I knew what I had experienced was real. It's been years since that happened, and even now, whenever I pass by the old factory, I feel a chill. The memories of that night come rushing back, and I wonder what exactly I encountered in that basement. When I first moved to Chicago, I was excited about starting a new job and finally living in a big city. The apartment I found was a decent 2-bedroom place in Lincoln Park. Nothing fancy, but clean and affordable. The only catch was that I needed a roommate to help cover the rent. I thought I'd lucked out when I found Kevin through a popular roommate finding app. He seemed nice enough, professional, easygoing, and with a stable job as a software developer. We met for coffee, hit it off, and within a week he moved in. For the first few weeks, everything seemed perfect. Kevin was quiet, kept to himself, and paid his share of the rent on time. We didn't hang out much, but that was fine by me. We were both busy with work and our own lives. It was nice to come home to a peaceful apartment after a long day. But then, seemingly out of nowhere, strange things started happening. It began with little things. I'd noticed that some of my mail was missing, or that my documents seemed to have been moved. At first, I chalked it up to my absent-mindedness. I had a lot going on, and I figured I was just misplacing things. But then, one morning I received a call from my bank about unusual activity on my credit card. Someone had charged several expensive items to my account, all from a high-end electronics store across town. Panicked, I immediately canceled the card and reported the fraud. I tried remembering when I might have lost my card, but nothing made sense. I always kept it in my wallet, either in my pocket or safely tucked away in my room. The only other person with access to the apartment was Kevin. I confronted him about it that evening. "Hey Kevin, have you seen my credit card lying around? There were some fraudulent charges made, and I can't figure out how it happened." Kevin looked genuinely surprised. "Of course not, I haven't seen it at all. But that's weird though, maybe someone stole your info online, that happens sometimes." His response seemed sincere, and I didn't want to accuse him without proof. But something about the situation felt off. I decided to keep a closer eye on my belongings and be more vigilant about my personal information. Over the next few weeks, more unsettling things started happening. I noticed that my social security card, which I kept hidden in a locked drawer, had been moved. My passport was also missing for a couple of days before mysteriously reappearing in the same drawer. Whenever I mentioned these things to Kevin, he acted concerned and offered to help me look for the missing items, but nothing ever turned up. One night, I was working late on a project for my job when I received an email from a credit monitoring service. It alerted me to a new credit card application made in my name. I hadn't applied for any new cards. Someone was trying to steal my identity. Fear gripped me as I realized what was happening. I immediately called the credit card company and had the application canceled. Then, I started putting the pieces together. Kevin was the only one who had access to my personal information. He had to be the one behind this. But why? And how? I knew I needed to gather more evidence before confronting him. I began discreetly checking Kevin's room when he wasn't home, looking for anything that could link him to the identity theft. It wasn't easy. Kevin was meticulous and his room was always tidy. But one day I found a small notebook hidden under his mattress. The notebook was filled with my personal information: social security number, bank account details, credit card numbers. There were also notes about my daily routine, including when I left for work, when I came home, and even the passwords to some of my online accounts. My hands trembled as I flipped through the pages, horrified by how much he knew about me. It was clear that Kevin had been watching me, studying me, and planning this for who knows how long. I felt violated, betrayed, and terrified all at once. I needed to get out of this situation, but I couldn't just leave. Kevin was still in the apartment, and I didn't know what he was capable of. I decided to play it cool and act like nothing was wrong. That evening, I pretended everything was normal, chatting with Kevin about our days and making small talk. Inside, I was panicking, trying to figure out my next move. The following day, I took a personal day off work and went to the police. I brought the notebook with me and explained everything that had been happening. They advised me to change all my passwords, secure my financial accounts, and, most importantly, not to confront Kevin directly. The police began their investigation, but I knew it could take time before they had enough evidence to arrest him. Meanwhile, I couldn't stand the thought of staying in the apartment with Kevin for another night. I packed a bag and told him I was going out of town for a work trip. He didn't seem suspicious, but I could see him watching me closely as I left. For the next few days, I stayed with a friend, checking in with the police regularly. They discovered that Kevin had a history of identity theft and fraud in other states, using different aliases to avoid detection. They also found that he had been slowly draining money from my accounts, making small, unnoticeable withdrawals over time. It wasn't long before the police had enough to arrest Kevin. They executed the arrest while he was at home, catching him off guard. I was relieved when they called to tell me he was in custody, but I couldn't shake the fear that had settled deep inside me. When I finally returned to the apartment, it felt different. I packed up my things and decided to move out. I couldn't stay in a place where I'd been so thoroughly violated, where someone had invaded every aspect of my life. As I settled into a new apartment in a different part of the city, I tried to put the experience behind me, but the scars remained, and I found it hard to trust anyone, especially new roommates. A few years ago, I worked the night shift at a small rural hospital in West Virginia. It wasn't a big place, just a few floors and a handful of staff on duty during the late hours. My job as a nurse was demanding, but I loved the calm and quiet of the night shift. The patients were mostly asleep, and the stillness allowed me to focus on my work. One night, I was assigned to the third floor, which housed the long-term care patients. This floor always had an eerie feel to it. The hallways were dimly lit, and the old building creaked and groaned with every gust of wind. It didn't help that there were stories among the staff about strange occurrences, whispers in the dark, and shadows that moved on their own. That night it was just me and another nurse, Rachel, covering the floor. Around 2 a.m. I was making my rounds, checking on the patients. The floor was unusually quiet, and a sense of unease settled over me. As I walked past room 307, I heard a faint humming. It sounded like an old lullaby, soft and almost soothing. I paused, listening closely. The room's occupant, Mrs. Carmichael, was a comatose patient who had been unresponsive for years. There was no way she could be making that sound. I pushed the door open slowly and peeked inside. The room was dark, the only light coming from the small window. Mrs. Carmichael lay in her bed, motionless. The humming continued, but it seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I took a step inside and the air turned icy cold. Goosebumps rose on my arms and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. "Is someone there?" I whispered, feeling foolish but unable to stop myself. The humming stopped abruptly, replaced by a heavy silence. I quickly checked on Mrs. Carmichael, finding nothing out of the ordinary, and left the room, my heart pounding. I hurried back to the nurse's station where Rachel was filling out some paperwork. "Did you hear that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hear what?" Rachel looked up, frowning. "The humming, from room 307. Rachel's face paled slightly. "I've heard it before," she admitted quietly. "No one knows where it comes from. The staff calls it the lullaby ghost. It's just one of the many strange things that happen here." We decided to stay together for the rest of the shift, both of us feeling uneasy. Around 3:30 a.m., the call button for room 312 lit up. We exchanged nervous glances. Room 312 had been empty for weeks, waiting for a new patient. With a sense of trepidation, we made our way down the hall. The door to room 312 was ajar, and the air inside was frigid, much colder than the rest of the hospital. As we stepped inside, we saw the call button on the wall blinking. Rachel walked over to turn it off while I stood by the door, feeling a sense of foreboding. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind us, plunging the room into darkness. We both screamed, fumbling for the light switch. When the lights flickered on, the room was empty, but the sense of being watched was palpable. "Let's get out of here," Rachel said, her voice shaking. We hurried back to the nurse's station, locking the door behind us. For the rest of the night, we kept the lights on and stayed within sight of each other, jumping at every small sound. When the morning staff arrived, we were exhausted and more than ready to leave. Over the next few weeks, the strange occurrences continued. Lights flickered, cold spots appeared, and the humming would return sporadically. The stories of the lullaby ghost spread, and the third floor became a place of dread for the night staff. Eventually, I left the hospital for a new job, but the memories of those nights stayed with me. Even now, when I think back to those shifts, I can still hear that haunting lullaby and feel the cold, watchful presence in the darkened halls. It was supposed to be a routine business trip, a quick overnight stay at the Redwood Hotel in Seattle, Washington. The hotel was modern and sleek, nestled in the heart of downtown, a perfect spot for both tourists and business travelers. I checked in late in the afternoon, exhausted from a long day of meetings. My room on the 7th floor was spacious and comfortable, with a great view of the city skyline. I had no idea that this seemingly normal evening would turn into the most terrifying night of my life. I spent the evening preparing for my presentation the next day, reviewing notes and organizing slides. Around 8 p.m., I decided to take a break and head down to the hotel bar for a drink and some dinner. The bar was bustling with the usual crowd, business people unwinding after a long day, tourists chatting excitedly about their plans, and a few locals enjoying the upscale atmosphere. As I sipped my drink and waited for my meal, I noticed a group of men enter the bar. They were dressed casually, nothing particularly remarkable about them, but something about their demeanor caught my attention. They seemed tense, constantly glancing around as if looking for someone. I brushed it off as paranoia from a long day and turned my attention back to my phone. Suddenly, the mood in the bar shifted. The men pulled out guns and the room fell silent. One of them, a tall man with a shaved head, stepped forward and spoke in a commanding voice. "Everyone, stay calm and do exactly as we say. This is a robbery, but no one needs to get hurt." My heart pounded in my chest as the reality of the situation sunk in. We were being held hostage. The other patrons looked equally terrified, some with their hands raised, others frozen in shock. The men quickly moved to secure the exits, locking the doors and drawing the curtains over the windows. The leader continued, "We just need a few hours and then we'll be out of your hair. Cooperate, and this will all be over soon." The robbers forced everyone to hand over their phones and valuables, piling them onto a table. They were efficient and methodical, clearly experienced. As they moved through the room, one of the men grabbed a young woman who had been sitting near the back. She cried out and the leader shot her a warning look. "No one leaves this room, understand?" She nodded, tears streaming down her face. My mind raced trying to process what was happening. The situation was bad, but it could get worse if anyone tried to resist or escape. I glanced around the room looking for any way out, but the robbers had covered all the exits. We were trapped. As the minutes turned into an hour, tension in the room grew. The robbers mostly ignored us, focusing on their own plans. They communicated in low voices, occasionally glancing at a tablet one of them held. I couldn't see what they were looking at, but it was clear they were waiting for something, or someone. Just when it seemed like the standoff might drag on indefinitely, one of the robbers suddenly stood up and started shouting, "They're here! We need to move!" Panic flashed across the leader's face. He turned to the hostages, his voice hard. "All right, everyone. We're going to move to another room. Stay close, stay quiet, and no one gets hurt." We were herded out of the bar and into a back hallway. As we walked, I noticed several doors along the corridor, some leading to conference rooms, others to storage areas. The robbers led us to a large conference room, forcing us inside and locking the door behind us. The room was dimly lit, with heavy drapes covering the windows. A few overhead lights cast long shadows, making the space feel even more claustrophobic. We were told to sit on the floor, and one of the men stood guard by the door. The rest of the robbers huddled together, speaking urgently. I strained to hear their conversation, catching snippets about police response times and possible escape routes. My anxiety grew as I realized the gravity of the situation. They hadn't planned for this. Something had gone wrong. After what felt like an eternity, the leader approached us. "All right, change of plans. We're going to use a few of you as leverage. The rest of you stay here. Don't try anything stupid." He pointed at me and two others, a middle-aged man and a young woman. "You three, up!" Fear surged through me as I stood up, unsure of what was about to happen. The leader ordered us to stand by the door, while the rest of the hostages huddled together, looking scared and helpless. The door opened and we were led out into the hallway. As we walked, I noticed the sounds of distant sirens. The police were here. We were taken to a service elevator and brought down to the basement. The robbers seemed agitated, their plan unraveling before their eyes. The leader spoke into a walkie-talkie, his voice tense. "We're coming out. We have hostages. Don't try anything." There was a pause, then a crackling response. "We're ready. Just don't hurt anyone." The elevator doors opened and we were marched through a maze of hallways, finally emerging into a dimly lit underground parking garage. The robbers pushed us toward a van parked near the exit. My heart raced as I realized they intended to take us with them. But just as we reached the van, a blinding light filled the garage and a booming voice echoed through the space. "This is the police. Drop your weapons and surrender." The robbers froze, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then chaos erupted. The robbers shouted at each other, some dropping their weapons, others raising them in a futile act of defiance. The police swarmed in, guns drawn, shouting commands. It was over in seconds. The robbers were overwhelmed and disarmed. As the adrenaline subsided, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The police officers quickly checked on us, making sure we were unharmed. We were escorted out of the garage and I stepped into the cool night air, finally free from the nightmare. The aftermath was a blur of statements, flashing lights, and concerned faces. The police took our statements and I learned that the robbers had been part of a larger criminal ring, planning a major heist that went awry. The hostages in the conference room were safely rescued, and the robbers were taken into custody. I left the Redwood Hotel that night, shaken, but grateful to be alive. The experience left me with a deep respect for the fragility of life and the unpredictable nature of the world. I've stayed in many hotels since, but I always check the locks, the exits, and keep a watchful eye on my surroundings. Some fears, once experienced, never truly fade. It was the Halloween party of the year, and everyone was talking about it. The Mitchells were famous for their extravagant parties, and this year was no exception. Their entire house was decked out in lights, cobwebs, and a haunted maze in the backyard. The place was packed, music echoing down the street. Party-goers milled about the front yard, laughing and drinking. Megan and I quickly made our way inside, eager to join the festivities. Inside, the party was in full swing. People in elaborate costumes danced, laughed, and filled every corner. But then, I noticed something strange. In the corner of the living room, a figure stood perfectly still, dressed in a plain black cloak with a white mask, with a blank, expressionless face. At first I thought it was a decoration, but then I realized it was a person. The figure didn't move, didn't talk, didn't even mingle. They just stood there, watching. I nudged Megan. "Look at that guy. Creepy, right?" She laughed. We shrugged it off and joined the party. For the next hour we drank and danced, but I kept noticing that masked figure, still in the same spot, just staring. Later we decided to check out the basement photo booth the Mitchells had set up, a dimly lit area with a fog machine and props. As we waited our turn, I saw him again. The figure in the mask was standing in the corner of the basement, just outside the reach of the flickering lights. A chill ran down my spine. "Hey, that guy is seriously creeping me out," I whispered to Megan. She turned, but the figure was gone. "You sure you're not imagining things?" she asked. But I knew what I had seen. We eventually made our way back upstairs. The energy of the party had shifted, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Shortly after midnight, people started leaving. Megan and I stuck around a bit longer. I hadn't seen the figure in a while, but the feeling of unease lingered. As we got ready to leave, I saw him again, standing by the front door, blocking our way. His blank white mask seemed to glow in the dim light, his posture unnaturally stiff. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stared. I grabbed Megan's arm and we slipped out the side door and down the street, my heart pounding. I glanced back, half expecting to see him following us, but the street was empty. Later that night, I got a text from Megan. It was a photo from the party, of us posing in front of the haunted house. But in the background was the figure in the mask, standing right behind us. I stared at the photo, realizing he hadn't just been another guest. He had been watching us the whole time. When I first moved to Portland, I was thrilled about starting a new chapter of my life. The city offered everything I wanted: a vibrant culture, great job opportunities, and plenty of activities. All I needed was a decent place to stay, and I thought I'd found the perfect situation with a shared apartment in the heart of the city. My roommate, Alex, seemed like a chill guy. Quiet, respectful, and kept to himself. Little did I know, I was about to enter a nightmare I could never have imagined. The first few weeks were uneventful. Alex and I hardly saw each other due to our opposite work schedules. I worked a typical 9 to 5 at a marketing firm, while Alex often came home late, muttering something about working at a tech startup. Our interactions were brief and polite, and everything seemed fine. The apartment was spacious and well kept, with 2 bedrooms, a cozy living room, and a small kitchen. It was everything I needed to settle into my new life. One night I came home later than usual, after grabbing dinner with friends. As I unlocked the front door, I heard loud noises coming from Alex's room. It sounded like a mix of shouting and banging, accompanied by some kind of aggressive music. I paused, wondering if he had friends over, but when I stepped inside, the apartment was dark except for the light seeping from under Alex's door. I ignored it and headed to my room, figuring it was none of my business. But as the night went on, the noise only got worse. The shouting turned into full-blown screaming, with Alex's voice rising above the music, and what I now recognized as video game sound effects. Curious and slightly concerned, I walked over to his door and knocked softly. The noise stopped abruptly, and for a moment, there was silence. Then the door swung open, revealing Alex, his face flushed and eyes wild. "What?" he snapped, glaring at me. "Hey, I just wanted to see if everything's okay. It sounded like a lot was going on in here," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. Alex stared at me for a moment, then scoffed. "I'm fine. Just gaming. It gets intense sometimes." He slammed the door shut without another word, and the noises resumed, even louder than before. I returned to my room, uneasy but willing to chalk it up to an overzealous gamer moment. After all, everyone had their hobbies, right? But as days turned into weeks, Alex's behavior became increasingly erratic. Almost every night the same scenario played out, loud noises, shouting, and aggressive outbursts from behind his closed door. It started affecting my sleep and concentration, making me irritable and tired at work. One evening I decided to have a conversation with Alex about it. I waited until he emerged from his room for a late-night snack. He was still wearing his gaming headset, eyes glazed over as he rummaged through the fridge. "Hey Alex, can we talk for a sec?" I began hesitantly. He glanced at me, pulling off his headset. "What's up?" "I've noticed you've been pretty loud at night with the gaming and all," I said carefully. "It's been hard for me to sleep. Do you think you could keep it down a bit?" Alex's expression darkened. "I'm just playing games. What's the big deal? It's not like I'm throwing parties or anything." "I get that," I replied, trying to stay calm. "But it's getting really disruptive. Maybe you could use headphones or turn down the volume." He huffed, clearly annoyed. "Fine. Whatever." He stalked back to his room, slamming the door behind him. I sighed, hoping that would be the end of it. The following night was quieter, and I thought maybe he'd taken my request to heart, but the calm was short-lived. A few days later, the noise returned with a vengeance. This time it wasn't just shouting. I heard crashes and what sounded like something hitting the walls. My heart raced as I realized the situation might be escalating. Concerned for my safety, I texted my friend Maya, who lived nearby. She suggested I call the landlord, Mr. Thompson, to report the disturbances. I hesitated, not wanting to seem like a tattletale, but I knew I couldn't continue living like this. I dialed Mr. Thompson's number, explaining the situation as calmly as I could. He listened and promised to speak with Alex the next day. True to his word, Mr. Thompson visited the apartment the following morning. I stayed in my room, listening to the muffled conversation through the door. Alex's voice was defensive, but Mr. Thompson was firm, reminding him of the building's noise policies. When the door finally closed behind our landlord, I breathed a sigh of relief, hoping that would be the end of the chaos. For a couple of days things were quiet, but then it all came crashing down, literally. It was a Friday night and I had decided to stay in and relax. As I lounged on the couch, I heard the familiar sounds of Alex gaming, but something felt different. The noises were sharper, angrier. Suddenly there was a loud crash followed by a string of curses. I jumped up alarmed and ran to Alex's door. Before I could knock, the door burst open, and Alex stormed out, his face twisted in rage. "Are you happy now?" he shouted, gesturing wildly. "Thanks to you and your complaints, I'm banned from my game server." I blinked, taken aback. "What are you talking about?" He was seething, barely able to contain his anger. "My team kicked me out because they said I was being too aggressive, and it's all your fault." He slammed his fist against the wall, making me flinch. "Alex, calm down," I said, trying to defuse the situation. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." But he wasn't listening. He continued ranting, his face red with fury. Suddenly, he grabbed a lamp from the hallway table and threw it across the room. It shattered against the wall, sending shards of glass everywhere. My heart pounded as I realized how dangerous the situation had become. "That's it," I said, backing away. "I'm calling the police." For a moment something flickered in Alex's eyes. Fear, maybe. But it was quickly replaced by anger. He turned on his heel and stormed back into his room, slamming the door so hard it shook the walls. With trembling hands, I called 911. The police arrived within minutes, and I explained the situation. They knocked on Alex's door, speaking to him in calm, authoritative tones. After a tense few moments, Alex emerged, his face pale and his demeanor subdued. The officers escorted him out, explaining that he would need to leave the premises and find another place to stay. I felt a mixture of relief and guilt as Alex was taken away. I hadn't wanted things to escalate this far, but I knew I had done the right thing. The next morning, as I cleaned up the mess from the shattered lamp, I reflected on the whole ordeal. Living with a nightmare roommate had been exhausting and frightening, but it had also taught me the importance of setting boundaries and standing up for myself. I've always been a bit of a skeptic when it comes to the supernatural. My job as a travel writer has taken me to countless hotels around the world, from luxurious resorts to seedy motels. I've heard all the ghost stories, urban legends, and creepy tales, but I never really believed them. That was until my stay at the Silver Oaks Inn, a quaint historic hotel nestled in the quiet town of Pine Hollow, Colorado. What was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway turned into a bone-chilling experience that still haunts me to this day. It all started innocently enough. I had planned a short trip to Pine Hollow to write about the town's famous fall foliage and cozy accommodations. The Silver Oaks Inn was perfect for my article. An old Victorian building with a storied past, beautifully preserved and exuding charm. The owner, Mrs. Thompson, welcomed me with a warm smile and gave me a quick tour of the premises, proudly sharing bits of the hotel's history. The inn had been a family-run establishment for over a century, passed down through generations. She mentioned that the inn had been a favorite among travelers for its peaceful ambiance and scenic views. My room was on the third floor, a quaint little suite with antique furniture and a large bay window overlooking the forest. It felt like stepping back in time. I spent the afternoon exploring the town, enjoying the crisp autumn air and the vibrant colors of the changing leaves. By the time I returned to the hotel, it was dusk. I settled into my room, pulled out my laptop, and started jotting down notes for my article. As night fell, the inn grew quiet. The only sounds were the occasional creaks of the old building settling and the wind rustling through the trees outside. I had just finished writing when I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere above me. I paused, listening closely. The sound was steady, almost like footsteps pacing back and forth. I shrugged it off as an old building making noise and went back to my work. A few minutes later, the tapping stopped, and I heard a soft knock on my door. I opened it, expecting to see Mrs. Thompson or one of the staff, but the hallway was empty. Confused, I stepped out and looked around, but there was no one there. I closed the door, feeling a slight unease settle in. I shook it off and decided to call it a night. Around midnight, I was awakened by the sound of a door creaking open. I sat up, straining to listen. It was followed by the unmistakable sound of someone walking in the hallway. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and seemed to stop right outside my door. My heart raced as I waited, holding my breath. There was a soft knock, just like before. This time I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened the door, only to find the hallway deserted once again. Now fully awake and thoroughly spooked, I decided to investigate. I walked down the hall, peering into the dimly lit corridors. The inn was eerily silent, and every shadow seemed to hold a secret. I checked the guest rooms, finding them all empty. Most of the rooms were vacant, as the inn wasn't particularly busy this time of year. But as I approached the end of the hall, I noticed one room with the door slightly ajar, room 312. I knocked softly, then pushed the door open. The room was empty, but something felt off. The air was cold, and I noticed an odd, musty smell, like old books mixed with dampness. The bed was neatly made, and there were no signs of recent occupancy. I stepped inside, looking around. That's when I saw it. A small, dusty journal lying on the nightstand. It looked ancient, the leather cover worn and cracked. I picked it up, my hands trembling slightly. As I flipped through the pages, I realized it was a guest book, filled with entries from decades ago. Most of the entries were mundane, notes about pleasant stays and kind words about the staff. But as I reached the final pages, the entries became more erratic, filled with frantic scribbles and unsettling comments about strange noises and ghostly apparitions. One entry caught my eye. It was dated 50 years ago, written by a man named James Porter. The handwriting was messy, almost desperate. It described a haunting experience. James had heard footsteps in the hallway, followed by knocking on his door, just like I had. He wrote about seeing a shadowy figure at the foot of his bed and feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. The entry ended abruptly with a final chilling note. I can't take it anymore. The tapping won't stop. I have to leave. As I finished reading, a chill ran down my spine. It was too similar to what I was experiencing. I quickly put the journal down and left the room, closing the door behind me. My mind raced as I returned to my room, trying to make sense of what I had read. Could it be that the hotel was haunted? The rational part of me rejected the idea, but the eerie events of the night made me question everything. Back in my room, I double-checked the lock on my door and crawled into bed, pulling the covers up to my chin. I lay there wide awake, listening to the sounds of the old inn. Hours passed, and just as I was starting to relax, I heard it again. The tapping. It was louder this time, more insistent. My heart pounded in my chest as I clutched the blankets tighter. The sound moved closer, stopping right outside my door. Suddenly, the door handle rattled, as if someone was trying to open it. I froze, my eyes locked on the door. The rattling stopped, and then, to my horror, the door slowly creaked open. My breath caught in my throat as I stared into the darkness beyond. A shadowy figure stood in the doorway, its form indistinct but undeniably there. It felt like time stood still as we stared at each other, the air thick with tension. The figure slowly raised a hand, pointing directly at me. An icy chill washed over me, and I felt an overwhelming urge to flee. But I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure then turned and disappeared down the hallway. As soon as it was gone, I jumped out of bed, grabbed my things, and ran out of the room. I didn't stop until I was in my car, speeding away from the Silver Oaks Inn. The next day I contacted Mrs. Thompson and apologized for leaving so abruptly. I didn't mention the haunting or the figure in the hallway. I didn't want to sound crazy. She seemed understanding and told me that strange things had happened at the inn before. But she never believed the stories. I knew better. I never finished the article about Pine Hollow. The memory of that night still lingers, and I can't shake the feeling that something followed me from the Silver Oaks Inn. I've stayed in countless hotels since then, but none have left me as terrified as that one. Sometimes in the dead of night, I still hear the faint tapping, a reminder of the phantom guest that haunted my stay at the Silver Oaks Inn.